Good afternoon. Welcome to our Lincoln event, Lincoln Oratory and the Unfinished Work of Freedom, an interactive symposium. So I want to begin by telling you just a bit about the title here. Lincoln should be clear, but it's actually our event this afternoon is part of a campus-wide event in conjunction with the American Library Association. And the event, if you haven't seen it yet, go see it. It's at South, there's an exhibit there, South Campus. And it's dedicated to exploring Lincoln, the Constitution, and the Civil War. And so our event today takes place in that connection. We, though, are doing the oratory part. That's what we like to do here at Deerwood. We like to talk and to talk well. And for your pleasure this afternoon, we have several distinguished speakers that I will introduce to you in a minute. Finally, unfinished work of freedom. That, of course, is a reference to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address that we'll hear at the very end of this session. But it's also to say that we are participating in the work, in the discussion, in the labor that we will hear in just a minute. In short, history is an ongoing conversation, and they are going to start the conversation, but we will invite you to engage in the conversation. And so at the end, as time permits and your inclination permits, we will have time for questions with all of our speakers, and that will be the interactive symposium part of our event today. So let me then get right into it and tell you that for this first act, there will be a total of 2 acts. This first act will go for about an hour, and then we'll have our second act beginning at 5:30. And in this first act, we are going to the sources themselves, the original text with Lincoln, and we have one non-Lincoln, Horace Greeley, a journalist from the time. In our second act, beginning at 5:30, then we will look at how contemporaries of Lincoln, as well as people since then, in the 20th century and up until this day in the 21st century, how they responded to Lincoln and how they continued his legacy. So we are going to start with Lincoln's well-known House Divided speech. And it will be presented by 2 speakers. It's a challenging work. We've edited it down to a reasonable amount of time. Back in the day, they didn't believe in that. If a speech didn't go for an hour and a half, it wasn't a real speech. We've got it down to about 8 minutes. We'll see. And it's going to be delivered by Sam Radomski and Corey Parker. And I chose this speech, we chose this speech, because it starts with Lincoln making a bold prediction. He says, I can tell you the future and the fate of America. Either America will become entirely free, there will be no slavery anywhere throughout this great land, or it will become entirely slave-holding. Slaves will be alike legal north and south alike. Now that's a bold prediction, and that's why it makes fun stuff to read and to hear today. But we also, we want to start here because we want to see that Lincoln wasn't just making bold predictions and orating and making hand gestures. In short, he was actually a politician, and he made this speech as a way to kick off his election year, 1858. Vote Lincoln. So who was Lincoln running against? He was running against Democratic Senator Stephen Douglas. And indeed, all the people that Lincoln mentions in this speech were Democrats. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a Democrat. The President, James Buchanan, a Democrat. And so Lincoln is here to kick off his campaign for Senate by smacking around the Democrats a little bit, not just to give us a nice prediction. Now we need to know just a couple of historical details. We know Lincoln was a Republican. The Republican Party was formed early, had just recently been formed in 1854, and it was a response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed slavery to expand into Western territories where it had formerly not been allowed to expand. And that prompted a sharp response among many in the North, prompting the creation of a new party that exists today. So one part of what Lincoln is going to say is, that's bad, and we need to be against westward expansion. We'll also see the discussion of the famous Dred Scott case. And in the speech, it will explain what that involved. But briefly, it was a Supreme Court case which said that Dred Scott, an African American, had no rights that the Constitution was bound to respect. Now, Lincoln gave this speech at the Republican convention in Illinois. They had just chosen him to be our guy for the Senate. And so he's giving a speech to people who should be supporting him. But at the time, in 1858, there were a lot of people in the state of Illinois who said, why don't we go with your competitor, Stephen Douglas? And so what Lincoln is going to show here is Douglas, he may be having a fight with the president right now over this issue of Kansas. Should we respect this new Constitution? Should we elect Kansas in? Lincoln has to say, no, don't go with Douglas. Go with me. I stand for principles. I stand for very important principles about slavery. And that's how he's going to make his case. So with that, I then give you our two speakers, Sam and Parker.
A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, north as well as south. Have we no tendency to the latter condition? Let anyone who doubts carefully contemplate the Nebraska Act and the Dred Scott decision. In the new year of 1854, found slavery excluded from more than half the states by the state constitutions, and from most of the national territory by the congressional prohibition. 4 days later commenced the struggle which ended the repealing that congressional prohibition. This opened all the national territory to slavery, while the Nebraska bill was still passing through Congress, a law case involving the question of a slave's freedom by reason of his owner having voluntarily taken him into a free state, was passing through the U.S. Circuit Court. The slave's name was Dred Scott. The several points of the Dred Scott decision are, first, that no Negro slave and no descendant of such a slave can ever be a citizen. Secondly, neither Congress nor a territorial legislature can exclude slavery from any U.S. state's territory. This point is made in order that individual man may fill up the territories with slaves without danger of losing them as property, and thus to enhance the chances of permanency to the institution through all the future. Thirdly, the logical conclusion that what Dred Scott master might lawfully do with Dred Scott in the free state of Illinois, every other master may lawfully do with any other 1 or 1,000 slaves in Illinois, or in any other free state. This works to educate and mold public opinion, at least northern public opinion, to not care whether slavery is voted down or voted up. This shows exactly where we are, and partially also whether we are tending.
At length, a squabble has sprung up between the President and the author of the Nebraska bill, Mr. Douglas, on the question of whether the Lecompton Constitution was or was not made by the people of the Kansas. And in that squabble, the latter declares that all he wants is fair vote for all the people, and that he cares not whether slavery be voted down or voted up. His declaration that he cares not whether slavery be voted down or voted up is an apt definition of the policy he would impress upon the public mind. While the justices of the court in the Dred Scott case declare the Constitution neither permits Congress nor a territorial legislature to exclude slavery from any United States territory, they all omit to declare whether or not the Constitution permits a state or the people of a state to exclude it. Possibly this is a mere omission, but who can be quite sure? And this may especially be expected if the doctrine of care not whether slavery be voted down or voted up shall gain upon the public mind sufficiently to allow such a decision to be maintained. Such a decision is all that slavery now lacks of being alike lawful in all states. Welcome or unwelcome, such a decision is probably coming, and will soon be upon us, unless the power of the present political dynasty shall be met and overthrown. We shall lie down pleasantly, dreaming of all the people in Missouri, that they are on the verge of making their state free. And we shall awake to the reality instead that the Supreme Court has made Illinois a slave state. To meet and overthrow the power of the dynasty is the work now before us. That is what we have to do. But how can we best do it? Stephen Douglas, if not a dead lion for his work, is at least a caged and toothless one. How can he oppose the advantage of slavery? He don't care anything about. His avowed mission is impressing the public heart to care nothing about it. For years he has labored to prove it a sacred right of white men to take Negro slaves into the new territories. He has done all in his power to reduce the whole question of slavery to one of mere right of property. Now as ever, I wish not to misrepresent Judge Douglas, question his motives, or out that he be personally offensive to him. Whether, if ever, he and we can come together so that our great cause may have assistance from his great ability, I hope to impose no obstacle. But clearly, he is not now with us. He does not promise to ever be. Our cause then must be entrusted to those who care for the result. 2 years ago, the Republicans of this nation mustered over 1,300,000 strong. Did we brave all then to falter now? Did the result not be doubtful? We shall not fail. If we stand firm, we will not fail. Wise counsels may accelerate or mistakes delay it, but sooner or later, the victory is sure to come.
Vote Lincoln. That was his message, and it didn't work. He did not win the senatorial race in 1858. But in 1860, he did receive his party's nomination to run for the presidency, and of course, he did, in fact, win. We turn now then to his first inaugural address that he gave upon becoming President of the United States of America. And that will be delivered by Odie Kurt. Give me one, I'm sorry, sorry. Give me one more minute. I know, it's exciting. I just want to give you a brief preview of what did Lincoln say and of the context. So Lincoln was elected, then as now they held their elections in November. And Lincoln won, but before he took office in March, back then the inauguration day took place on March 4th, much like today. And in between the time he was elected, but before he took office, some 7 southern states had seceded from the Union. That is, before Lincoln had taken any official act whatsoever. And so when he spoke to the people, he wanted to persuade the South that their fears about him were not justified. And so he begins by saying that the South has nothing to fear for him. Yes, in 1858, he said a house divided against itself may not stand. But we know that politicians have to tweak their message. And here he says, but I never said I would take any action against slavery where it now exists, namely in the South. And so that's the message that he begins with in his first inaugural. Communication scholars Kathleen Hall Jamieson and Carlin Corris Campbell have also noted that presidential inaugurals perform other functions. In particular, inaugural addresses by presidents when they become president perform several functions. One key one is to acknowledge constitutional limits on the power of the president. The president's power is not unlimited. It's also to rehearse shared American values. And both of these messages are on display here in Lincoln's first inaugural. Indeed, when he begins, he says that I am taking this inaugural oath exactly as the Constitution prescribes, and I will be bound by the Constitution. And then, of course, when he concludes his speech, He gives us some of the most moving language ever spoken by American president about uniting and remaining bound to those mystic cords of memory that bind Americans together. And now we will hear from Odie deliver passages from Lincoln's first inaugural.
Fellow citizens of the United States, in compliance with a custom as old as the government itself, I appear before you to address you and to take in your presence the oath prescribed by the Constitution of the United States. Apprehension seems to exist among the people of the southern states that by the accession of a Republican administration, their property and their peace and personal security are endangered. There has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension. Indeed, ample evidence to the contrary has all the while existed in nearly all the public speeches of him who now addresses you. I do but quote from one. I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it already exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. I reiterate these sentiments, and in doing so, I only press upon the public attention the most conclusive evidence that the property, peace, and security of no section are to be endangered by the now incoming administration. It is 72 years since the first inauguration of a president under our national Constitution. During that period, 15 different citizens have administered the executive branch. Yet I now enter upon the same task under great and peculiar difficulty. A disruption of the federal union, heretofore only menaced, is attempted. I hold that, in contemplation of universal law and the Constitution, the union of these states is perpetual. Perpetuity is implied, if not expressed, in the fundamental law of all national governments. It is safe to assert that no government proper ever had a provision for its own termination. Descending from these general principles, we find that the Union is perpetual and confirmed by the history of the Union itself. The Union is much older than the Constitution. It was formed by the Articles of Association in 1774. It was matured and continued by the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And in 1787, one of the declared objects for establishing the Constitution was to form a more perfect union. But if the destruction of the union by a part of the states be lawfully possible, the union is less perfect than before the Constitution. It follows from these views that no state, upon its own mere motion, can lawfully get out of the union, that resolves and ordinances to that effect are legally void, and that acts of violence against the authority of the United States are insurrectionary or revolutionary according to circumstances. That there are persons in one section or another who seek to destroy the Union at all events and are glad of any pretext to do it, I will neither affirm nor deny. But if there be such, I need address no word to them. To those, however, who really love the Union, may I not speak? Before entering upon so grave a matter as the destruction of our national fabric, with all its benefits, its memories, and its hopes, would it not be wise to ascertain why we do it? All profess to be content in the Union, if all constitutional rights can be maintained. Is it true then that any right plainly written in the Constitution has been denied? I think not. Shall fugitives from labor be surrendered by national or by state authority? The Constitution does not expressly say. May Congress prohibit slavery in the territories? The Constitution does not expressly say. Must Congress protect slavery in the territories? The Constitution does not expressly say. From questions of this class spring all our constitutional controversies. One section of the country believes slavery is right and ought to be extended, while the other believes it is wrong and ought not to be extended. This is the only substantial dispute. My countrymen, one and all, think calmly and well upon this whole subject. In your hands, and not in mine, is this momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I shall have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it. I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passions may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature.
Of course, we know that Lincoln's appeal to the South not to take that action did not work. And the war began. And it continued. And as it continued, disagreements broke out among some of Lincoln's strongest supporters, die-hard anti-slavery men like Horace Greeley, who was the editor of the New York Tribune. And here we will hear from Greeley, and then we'll hear Lincoln's response to Greeley. And at issue was, so can't we do more, we, the Union, do more by using military force to put an end once and for all to slavery? And Greeley's point was yes, yes we can. And Lincoln's response was, let's go slow. At issue were two particular laws, the Confiscation Act of 1861 and the Confiscation Act of 1862. And what was being confiscated was lots of different kinds of property, but the most controversial one was property in human flesh. Could slaves held to those who were then in rebellion against the Union, could those slaves be freed? Congress had declared that they could. And Greeley pressed Lincoln to do everything he could to expand and force his generals to support it. And Lincoln, as we'll see in the response, said, go slow. Now, here we see an issue, a question of means and ends. What's the best way to end slavery? What's the best way to win the war? And that's a technical question. But we can see here in these questions about means and ends, perennial questions, questions which we can think about and discuss even today. What are our highest ends? What are the best means to achieve them? If we would end slavery, not just in the United States, but throughout the world, what are the best means adapted to that? So here we see two passionate men, friends often, here speaking to one another publicly. What should we do? We'll begin then with Martin Crabtree reading the editorial that Greeley published in his own Tribune.
To Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States. Dear Sir, I do not intrude to tell you, for you must know already, that a great proportion of those who desire the suppression of the rebellion now desolating our country are sorely disappointed by the policy you seem to be pursuing with regard to the slaves of the rebels. We think you are strangely and disastrously remiss in the discharge of your official duty with regard to the emancipating provisions of the new Confiscation Act. Those provisions were designed to fight slavery with liberty. They prescribe that men loyal to the Union and willing to shed their blood in her behalf shall no longer be held in bondage to traitors. We think you are unduly influenced by certain fossil politicians hailing from the border slave states. Knowing well that the loyal portion of the white citizens of those states do not expect nor desire that slavery shall be upheld to the prejudice of the Union. We ask you to consider that slavery is everywhere the inciting cause and sustaining base of treason. It seems to us the most obvious truth that whatever strengthens slavery in the border states, drives home the wedge intended to divide the Union. Had you, sir, in your inaugural address unmistakably given notice that if the rebellion already commenced were persisted in, you would recognize no loyal person as rightfully held in slavery by a traitor, we believe the rebellion would therein have received a staggering, if not fatal, blow. Let me call your attention to the recent tragedy in New Orleans. A considerable body of men held in slavery by two rebel sugar planters in defiance of the Confiscation Act left plantations 30 miles distant and made their way to the Great Mart of the Southwest, which they knew to be in possession of the Union forces. They came to us for liberty and protection. They met with hostility, captivity, and murder. They were butchered or re-enslaved by the help of the Union soldiers. If others shall hereafter suffer in like manner, the world will lay blame on you. Mr. President, the loyal millions of your countrymen require of you an unqualified execution of the Confiscation Act. That act gives freedom to the slaves of rebels coming within our lines. As one of the millions who feel the triumph of the Union is dispensable not only to the existence of our country, but to the well-being of mankind, I entreat you to render a hearty and unequivocal obedience to the law of the land. Yours, Horace Greeley.
To the Honorable Horace Greeley, dear sir, I have just read your letter of the 19th, addressed to myself through the New York Tribune. If there be in your letter any statements or assumptions of the fact, which I may know to be erroneous, I do not controvert them. If there be any inferences in which I may believe to be falsely drawn, I do not argue against them. If there be perceptible in it an impatient and dictatorial tone, I waive it in deference to an old friend, whose heart I've always supposed to be right. As to the policy I seem to be pursuing, as you say, I have not meant to leave anyone in doubt. I would save the Union. I would save it in the shortest way under the Constitution. If there be those who would not save the Union, unless they could at the same time save slavery, I do not agree with them. If there be those who would not save the Union, unless they could at the same time destroy slavery, I do not agree with them. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union. It is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would be to help save the Union. I shall do less whenever I shall believe what I am doing hurts the cause, and I shall do more whenever I shall believe I am doing more. Will it help the cause? Shall I try to correct these errors when them shown to be errors? I shall adopt new views so fast as they shall appear to be true views. I've here stated my purpose, according to my view of official duty. I intend no modification of my oft-expressed personal wish that all men everywhere should be free. Yours, A. Lincoln.
The question of slavery and of the Constitution, of means and ends, remained with Lincoln throughout his presidency. And in this next letter, though, we see a development in his thinking and in his speaking on the issue of slavery. He remains concerned with acting within the constitutional limitations of the office of the presidency. He also remains concerned with means and ends. What's the best way to win the war? But we also see a new vocabulary emerging in Lincoln's speaking and writing about the subject in slavery. In particular, we see him introducing the God of the Old Testament that brings wrath and divine punishment. And this theme will crystallize in his second inaugural address, which to hear, you must come to the second session of our Lincoln event. But here we see all three of these vocabularies: the Constitution, the means and ends, how to win it with military efficiency, and then finally, divine punishment and the soul of America. All three of these vocabularies are here in this brief letter. And he wrote it in response to a man who also a journalist, and he'd been discussing these very issues, and then he committed them to writing. And here now we will hear John Newbern present Lincoln's letter to Albert Hodges.
My dear sir, you asked me to put in writing the substance of what I verbally said the other day. It is about as follows. I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. And yet I have never understood the presidency conferred upon me an unrestricted right to act officially upon this judgment and feeling. It was the oath I took I would, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Nor was it my view that I might take that oath to get power and break the oath in using the power. I had publicly declared this many times. And I aver that to this day I have done no official act in mere deference to my abstract feeling and judgment on slavery. I did understand, however, that my oath imposed upon me a duty of preserving that government and that nation of which that Constitution was the organic law. Was it possible to lose this nation and yet preserve the Constitution? By general law, life and limb must be protected, yet often a limb must be amputated to save a life. I felt that measures otherwise unconstitutional might become lawful by becoming indispensable to the preservation of the Constitution and the nation. Right or wrong, I assume this ground, and now avow it. When early in the war, General Fremont attempted military emancipation, I forbade it, because I did not think it an indispensable necessity. When in July 1862, I appealed to the border states to favor compensated emancipation. I believed the indispensable necessity for arming blacks would come, unless averted by that measure. They declined, and I was driven to the alternative of either surrender to the Union or of laying strong hand upon the colored element. I chose the latter. In choosing it, I hoped for greater gain than loss, but of this I was not entirely confident. More than a year of trial now shows no loss by it in our foreign relations, none in our home popular sentiment, and none in our white military force. No loss by it anyhow or anywhere. I add a word of which was not in verbal conversation. In telling this tale, I attempt no compliment to my own sagacity. I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me. Now, at the end of the 3-year struggle, the nation's condition is not what either party or man devised or expected. Only God can claim it. Whither it is tending seems plain. If God now wills the removal of a great wrong, and also wills that we of the North, as well as you of the South, shall pay fairly for our complicity in that wrong, impartial history will find therein new cause to attest and revere the justice and goodness of God. Yours truly, A. Lincoln.
In our final speech of this first act of our 2-act play, we turn to the Gettysburg Address. And of course, the Gettysburg Address is one that we still turn to today. Why? It invokes grand, noble principles about liberty and equality and a new birth of freedom. Principles that spoke to people then, but still speak to us today. So what was happening that day? Well, months before, in fact, on July 1st, 1863, great forces of Union soldiers and of Confederate soldiers met outside the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, some 120,000 troops altogether. After 3 days fighting, some 50,000 would be casualties. Months later, Lincoln traveled there as an afterthought, almost, to address a crowd. The main speaker was Edward Everett, who, as was the custom of the time, spoke for 2 hours about the glories of the Union and of the sure victory to come. Lincoln avoided those topics and kept things simple. And he spoke in general principles that at the time did not elicit a strong response. A few Republican newspapers and a few Democratic newspapers commented. But after he died, within weeks, people began to turn to the Gettysburg Address, and they still turn to that address today. This afternoon we'll hear Kayla Blunt, and she will deliver it, and then she will give her own thoughts on its meaning, and she will then lead us into the interactive part.
Fourscore 70 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. We are now engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are now met on the great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of this field to those who gave their as a final resting place for those who gave their lives so that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what was said here, but they can never forget what was done here. It is for us, the living, rather to dedicate here to the unfinished works which they who fought here thus so far nobly advanced. It is rather for us to dedicate to the great task that remains before us, that these honored dead we take an increased devotion to the cause for which they gave their last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not die in vain, and that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government for the people, by the people, and of the people shall not perish on this earth. This speech alone holds a lot of power. Lincoln talks about how important it is that we should continue on the legacy in which our nation was founded. 152 years later, his words still apply to the world today. Whether it be an issue of human trafficking, equality in education, and far much more. Every day we must fight to keep and maintain equality. Since Lincoln gave his speech, the Gettysburg Address, equality has indeed gotten better. However, we still have a long way to go. We should pass this legacy down to our younger generation. Hundreds of lives are lost each and every day to carry on our nation's intended legacy of liberty and freedom for all men, women, and children, regardless of race, gender, class, sexuality, or belief. It is important that we dedicate our lives to continuing this cause that started centuries ago. Thank you.